Forging resolve. Purpose gives direction to one's efforts, but it does not necessarily make life easier. Goals can lead into all sorts of trouble, at which point one gets tempted to give them up and find some less demanding script by which to order one's actions. The price one pays for changing goals whenever opposition threatens is that while one may achieve a more pleasant and comfortable life, it is likely that it will end up empty and void of meaning. The Pilgrims who first settled this country decided that the freedom to worship according to their conscience was necessary to maintain the integrity of their selves. They believed that nothing mattered more than maintaining control over their relationship with the Supreme Being. Theirs was not a novel choice for an ultimate goal by which to order one's life. Many other people had done so previously. What distinguished the Pilgrims was that, like the Jews of Masada, the Christian martyrs, the Cathars of southern France in the late Middle Ages, who had chosen similarly, they did not allow persecution and hardship to blunt their resolve. Instead, they followed the logic of their convictions wherever it led, acting as if their values were worth giving up comfort and even life itself for. And because they acted thus, their goals, in fact, became worthwhile, regardless of whether they had been originally valuable. Because their goals had become valuable through commitment, they helped give meaning to the Pilgrims' existence. No goal can have much effect unless taken seriously. Each goal prescribes a set of consequences, and if one isn't prepared to reckon with them, the goal becomes meaningless. The mountaineer who decides to scale a difficult peak knows that he will be exhausted and endangered for most of the climb. But if he gives up too easily, his quest will be revealed as having little value. The same is true of all flow experiences. There is a mutual relationship between goals and the effort they require. Goals justify the effort they demand at the outset, but later it is the effort that justifies the goal. One gets married because the spouse seems worthy of sharing one's life with, but unless one then behaves as if this is true, the partnership will appear to lose value with time. All things considered, it cannot be said that humankind has lacked the courage to back its resolutions. Billions of parents in every age and in every culture have sacrificed themselves for their children and thereby made life more meaningful for themselves. Probably as many have devoted all their energies to preserving their fields and their flocks. Millions more have surrendered everything for the sake of their religion, their country, or their art. For those who have done so consistently, despite pain and failure, life as a whole had a chance to become like an extended episode of flow, a focused, concentrated, internally coherent, logically ordered set of experiences, which because of its inner order was felt to be meaningful and enjoyable. But as the complexity of culture evolves, it becomes more difficult to achieve this degree of total resolve. There are simply too many goals competing for prominence, and who is to say which one is worth the dedication of an entire life? Just a few decades ago, a woman felt perfectly justified in placing the welfare of her family as her ultimate goal. Partly this was due to the fact that she did not have many other options. Today, now that she can be a business person, a scholar, an artist, or even a soldier, it is no longer obvious that being a wife and mother should be a woman's first priority. The same embarrassment of riches affects us all. Mobility has freed us from ties to our birthplaces. There is no longer any reason to become involved in one's native community, to identify with one's place of birth. If the grass looks greener across the fence, we simply move to the other field. How about opening that little restaurant in Australia? Lifestyles and religions are choices that are easily switched. In the past, a hunter was a hunter until he died. A blacksmith spent his life perfecting his craft. We can now shed our occupational identities at will. No one needs to remain an accountant forever. The wealth of options we face today has extended personal freedom to an extent that would have been inconceivable even 100 years ago. But the inevitable consequence of equally attractive choices is uncertainty of purpose. Uncertainty, in turn, saps resolution, and lack of resolve ends up devaluing choice. Therefore, freedom does not necessarily help develop meaning in life. On the contrary, if the rules of a game become too flexible, concentration flags, and it is more difficult to attain a flow experience. commitment to a goal and to the rules it entails is much easier when the choices are few and clear. This is not to imply that a return to the rigid values and limited choices of the past would be preferable, even if that were a possibility, which it is not. The complexity and freedom that have been thrust upon us, and that our ancestors had fought so hard to achieve, are a challenge we must find ways to master. If we do, the lives of our descendants will be infinitely more enriched than anything previously experienced on this planet. If we do not, we run the risk of frittering away our energies on contradictory, meaningless goals. But in the meantime, how do we know where to invest psychic energy? There is no one out there to tell us, here is a goal worth spending your life on. Because there is no absolute certainty to which to turn, each person must discover ultimate purpose on his or her own. Through trial and error, through intense cultivation, we can straighten out the tangled skein of conflicting goals and choose the one that will give purpose to action. Self-knowledge, an ancient remedy so old that its value is easily forgotten, is the process through which one may organize conflicting options. Know thyself was carved over the entrance to the Delphic oracle, and ever since untold pious epigrams have extolled its virtue. The reason the advice is so often repeated is that it works. We need, however, to rediscover afresh every generation what these words mean, what the advice actually implies for each individual. And to do that, it is useful to express it in terms of current knowledge and envision a contemporary method for its application. Inner conflict is the result of competing claims on attention. Too many desires, too many incompatible goals struggle to marshal psychic energy toward their own ends. It follows that the only way to reduce conflict is by sorting out the essential claims from those that are not, and by arbitrating priorities among those that remain. There are basically two ways to accomplish this, what the ancients called the vita activa, a life of action, and the vita contemplativa, or the path of reflection. Immersed in the vita activa, a person achieves flow through total involvement in concrete external challenges. Many great leaders like Winston Churchill or Andrew Carnegie set for themselves lifelong goals that they pursued with great resolve, without any apparent internal struggle or questioning of priorities. Successful executives, experienced professionals, and talented craftspeople learn to trust their judgment and competence so that they again begin to act with the unself-conscious spontaneity of children. If the arena for action is challenging enough, a person may experience flow continuously in his or her calling, thus leaving as little room as possible for noticing the entropy of normal life. In this way, harmony is restored to consciousness indirectly, not by facing up to contradictions and trying to resolve conflicting goals and desires, but by pursuing chosen goals with such intensity that all potential competition is preempted. Action helps create inner order, but it has its drawbacks. A person strongly dedicated to achieving pragmatic ends might eliminate internal conflict, but often at the price of excessively restricting options. The young engineer who aims to become plant manager at age 45 and bends all his energies to that end may sail through several years successfully and without hesitation. Sooner or later, however, postponed alternatives may reappear again as intolerable doubts and regrets. Was it worth sacrificing my health for the promotion? What happened to those lovely children who have suddenly turned into sullen adolescents? Now that I have achieved power and financial security, what do I do with it? In other words, the goals that have sustained action over a period turn out not to have enough power to give meaning to the entirety of life. This is where the presumed advantage of a contemplative life comes in. Detached reflection upon experience, a realistic weighing of options and their consequences, have long been held to be the best approach to a good life. Whether it is played out on the psychoanalyst's couch, where repressed desires are laboriously reintegrated with the rest of consciousness, or whether it is performed as methodically as the Jesuits' test of conscience, which involves reviewing one's actions one or more times each day to check whether what one has been doing in the past few hours has been consistent with long-term goals, self-knowledge can be pursued in innumerable ways, each leading potentially to greater inner harmony. Activity and reflection should ideally complement and support each other. Action by itself is blind, reflection impotent. Before investing great amounts of energy in a goal, it pays to raise the fundamental questions. Is this something I really want to do? Is it something I enjoy doing? Am I likely to enjoy it in the foreseeable future? Is the price that I and others will have to pay worth it? Will I be able to live with myself if I accomplish it? These seemingly easy questions are almost impossible to answer for someone who has lost touch with his own experience. If a man has not bothered to find out what he wants, if his attention is so wrapped up in external goals that he fails to notice his own feelings, then he cannot plan action meaningfully. On the other hand, if the habit of reflection is well developed, a person need not go through a lot of soul-searching to decide whether a course of action is entropic or not. He will know, almost intuitively, that this promotion will produce more stress than it is worth, or that this particular friendship, attractive as it is, would lead to unacceptable tensions in the context of marriage. It is relatively easy to bring order to the mind for short stretches of time. Any realistic goal can accomplish this. A good game, an emergency at work, a happy interlude at home will focus attention and produce the harmonious experience of flow. But it is much more difficult to extend this state of being through the entirety of life. For this, it is necessary to invest energy in goals that are so persuasive that they justify effort even when our resources are exhausted and when fate is merciless in refusing us a chance at having a comfortable life. If goals are well chosen, and if we have the courage to abide by them despite opposition, we shall be so focused on the actions and events around us that we won't have the time to be unhappy. And then we shall directly feel a sense of order in the warp and the woof of life that fits every thought and emotion into a harmonious whole. Recovering harmony. The consequence of forging life by purpose and resolution is a sense of inner harmony, a dynamic order in the contents of consciousness. But, it may be argued, why should it be so difficult to achieve this inner order? Why should one strive so hard to make life into a coherent flow experience? Aren't people born at peace with themselves? Isn't human nature naturally ordered? The original condition of human beings, prior to the development of self-reflective consciousness, must have been a state of inner peace disturbed only now and again by tides of hunger, sexuality, pain, and danger. The forms of psychic entropy that currently cause us so much anguish, unfulfilled wants, dashed expectations, loneliness, frustration, anxiety, guilt, are all likely to have been recent invaders of the mind. They are byproducts of the tremendous increase in complexity of the cerebral cortex and of the symbolic enrichment of culture. They are the dark side of the emergence of consciousness. If we were to interpret the lives of animals with a human eye, we would conclude that they are in flow most of the time because their perception of what has to be done generally coincides with what they are prepared to do. When a lion feels hungry, it will start grumbling and looking for prey until its hunger is satisfied. Afterward, it lies down to bask in the sun, dreaming the dreams lions dream. There is no reason to believe that it suffers from unfulfilled ambition or that it is overwhelmed by pressing responsibilities. Animals' skills are always matched to concrete demands because their minds, such as they are, only contain information about what is actually present in the environment in relation to their bodily states, as determined by instinct. So a hungry lion only perceives what will help it to find a gazelle, while a sated lion concentrates fully on the warmth of the sun. Its mind does not weigh possibilities unavailable at the moment. It neither imagines pleasant alternatives, nor is it disturbed by fears of failure. Animals suffer just as we do when their biologically programmed goals are frustrated. They feel the pangs of hunger, pain, and unsatisfied sexual urges. Dogs bred to be friends to man grow distraught when left alone by their masters. But animals other than man are not in a position to be the cause of their own suffering. They are not evolved enough to be able to feel confusion and despair even after all their needs are satisfied. When free of externally induced conflicts, they are in harmony with themselves and experience the seamless concentration that in people we call flow. The psychic entropy peculiar to the human condition involves seeing more to do than one can actually accomplish and feeling able to accomplish more than what conditions allow. But this becomes possible only if one keeps in mind more than one goal at a time, being aware at the same time of conflicting desires. It can happen only when the mind knows not only what is, but also what could be. The more complex any system, the more room it leaves open for alternatives, and the more things can go wrong with it. This is certainly applicable to the evolution of the mind. As it has increased its power to handle information, the potential for inner conflict has increased as well. When there are too many demands, options, challenges, we become anxious. When too few, we get bored. To pursue the evolutionary analogy, and to extend it from biological to social evolution, it is probably true that in less developed cultures, where the number and complexity of social roles, of alternative goals and courses of action are negligible, the chances for experiencing flow are greater. The myth of the happy savage is based on the observation that when free of external threats, pre-literate people often display a serenity that seems enviable to the visitor from more differentiated cultures. But the myth tells only half the story. When hungry or hurting, the savage is no more happy than we would be. And he may be in that condition more often than we are. The inner harmony of technologically less advanced people is the positive side of their limited choices and of their stable repertoire of skills, just as the confusion in our soul is the necessary consequence of unlimited opportunities and constant perfectibility. Goethe represented this dilemma in the bargain Dr. Faustus, the archetype of modern man, made with Mephistopheles. The good doctor gained knowledge and power, but at the price of introducing disharmony in his soul. There is no need to visit far-off lands to see how flow can be a natural part of living. Every child, before self-consciousness begins to interfere, acts spontaneously with total abandon and complete involvement. Boredom is something children have to learn the hard way in response to artificially restricted choices. Again, this does not mean that children are always happy. Cruel or neglectful parents, poverty and sickness, the inevitable accidents of living make children suffer intensely. But a child is rarely unhappy without good reason. It is understandable that people tend to be so nostalgic about their early years. Like Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich, many feel that the wholehearted serenity of childhood, the undivided participation in the here and now, becomes increasingly difficult to recapture as the years go by. When we can imagine only few opportunities and few possibilities, it is relatively easy to achieve harmony. Desires are simple, choices clear. There is little room for conflict and no need to compromise. This is the order of simple systems, order by default, as it were. It is a fragile harmony. Step by step, with the increase of complexity, the chances of entropy generated internally by the system increase as well. We can isolate many factors to account for why consciousness gets to be more complex. At the level of the species, the biological evolution of the central nervous system is one cause. No longer ruled entirely by instincts and reflexes, the mind is endowed with the dubious blessing of choice. At the level of human history, the development of culture, of languages, belief systems, technologies, is another reason why the contents of the mind become differentiated. As social systems move from dispersed hunting tribes to crowded cities, they give rise to more specialized roles that often require conflicting thoughts and actions from the same person. No longer is every man a hunter, sharing skills and interests with every other man. The farmer and the miller, the priest and the soldier, now see the world differently from one another. There is no one right way to behave, and each role requires different skills. Within the individual lifespan as well, each person becomes exposed with age to increasingly contradictory goals, to incompatible opportunities for action. A child's options are usually few and coherent. With each year, they become less so. The earlier clarity that made spontaneous flow possible is obscured by a cacophony of disparate values, beliefs, choices, and behaviors. Few would argue that a simpler consciousness, no matter how harmonious, is preferable to a more complex one. While we might admire the serenity of the lion in repose, the tribesman's untroubled acceptance of his fate, or the child's wholehearted involvement in the present, they cannot offer a model for resolving our predicament. The order based on innocence is now beyond our grasp. Once the fruit is plucked from the tree of knowledge, the way back to Eden is barred forever. The unification of meaning in life themes. Instead of accepting the unity of purpose provided by genetic instructions or by the rules of society, The challenge for us is to create harmony based on reason and choice. Philosophers like Heidegger, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty have recognized this task of modern man by calling it the project, which is their term for the goal-directed actions that provide shape and meaning to an individual's life. Psychologists have used terms like appropriate strivings or life themes. In each case, these concepts identify a set of goals linked to an ultimate goal that gives significance to whatever a person does. The life theme, like a game that prescribes the rules and actions one must follow to experience flow, identifies what will make existence enjoyable. With a life theme, everything that happens will have a meaning, not necessarily a positive one, but a meaning nevertheless. If a person bends all her energies to making $1 million before age 30, whatever happens is a step either toward or away from that goal. The clear feedback will keep her involved with her actions. Even if she loses all her money, her thoughts and actions are tied by a common purpose, and they will be experienced as worthwhile. Similarly, a person who decides that finding a cure for cancer is what she wants to accomplish above all else will usually know whether she is getting closer to her goal or not. In either case, what must be done is clear, and whatever she does will make sense. When a person's psychic energy coalesces into a life theme, consciousness achieves harmony. But not all life themes are equally productive. Existential philosophers distinguish between authentic and inauthentic projects. The first describes the theme of a person who realizes that choices are free and makes a personal decision based on a rational evaluation of his experience. It does not matter what the choice is as long as it is an expression of what the person genuinely feels and believes. Inauthentic projects are those a person chooses because they are what she feels ought to be done, because they are what everybody else is doing, and therefore there is no alternative. Authentic projects tend to be intrinsically motivated, chosen for what they are worth in themselves. Inauthentic ones are motivated by external forces. A similar distinction is that between discovered life themes, when a person writes the script for her actions out of personal experience and awareness of choice, and accepted life themes, when a person simply takes on a predetermined role from a script written long ago by others. Both types of life themes help give meaning to life, but each has drawbacks. The accepted life theme works well as long as the social system is sound. If it is not, it can trap the person into perverted goals. Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi who calmly shipped tens of thousands to the gas chambers, was a man for whom the rules of bureaucracy were sacred. He probably experienced flow as he shuffled the intricate schedules of trains, making certain that the scarce rolling stock was available where needed, and that the bodies were transported at the least expense. He never seemed to question whether what he was asked to do was right or wrong. As long as he followed orders, his consciousness was in harmony. For him, the meaning of life was to be part of a strong, organized institution. Nothing else mattered. In peaceful, well-ordered times, a man like Adolf Eichmann might have been an esteemed pillar of the community. But the vulnerability of his life theme becomes apparent when unscrupulous and demented people seize control of society. Then, such an upright citizen turns into an accessory to crimes without having to change his goals, and without even realizing the inhumanity of his actions. Discovered life themes are fragile for a different reason. Because they are products of a personal struggle to define the purpose of life, they have less social legitimacy. Because they are often novel and idiosyncratic, they may be regarded by others as crazy or destructive. Some of the most powerful life themes are based on ancient human goals, but freshly discovered and freely chosen by the individual. Malcolm X, who in his early life followed the behavioral script for young men in the slum, fighting and dealing drugs, discovered in jail, through reading and reflection, a different set of goals through which to achieve dignity and self-respect. In essence, he invented an entirely new identity, although one that was made up of bits and pieces of earlier human achievements. Instead of continuing to play the game of hustlers and pimps, he created a more complex purpose that could help order the lives of many other marginal men, black or white. A man interviewed in one of our studies, whom we shall designate as E, provides another example of how a life theme can be discovered, even though the purpose underlying it is a very ancient one. E grew up the son of a poor immigrant family in the early part of this century. His parents knew only a few words of English and were barely able to read and write. They were intimidated by the frenetic pace of life in New York, but they worshipped and admired America and the authorities who represented it. When he was 7, E's parents spent a good chunk of their savings to buy him a bicycle for his birthday. A few days later, as he was riding in the neighborhood, he was hit by a car that had ignored a stop sign. E suffered serious wounds and his bike was wrecked. The driver of the car was a wealthy doctor. He drove E to a hospital, asking him not to report what had happened, but promising in return to pay for all expenses and to buy him a new bike. E and his parents were convinced, and they went along with the deal. Unfortunately, the doctor never showed up again, and E's father had to borrow money to pay the expensive hospital bill. The bike was never replaced. This event could have been a trauma that left its scar on E forever, turning him into a cynic who would from now on look out for his own self-interest no matter what. Instead, E drew a curious lesson from his experience. He used it to create a life theme that not only gave meaning to his own life, but helped reduce entropy in the experience of many other people. For many years after the accident, E and his parents were bitter, suspicious, and confused about the intentions of strangers. E's father, feeling that he was a failure, took to drinking and became morose and withdrawn. It looked as though poverty and helplessness were having their expected effects. But when he was 14 or 15 years old, E had to read in school the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He connected the principles in those documents with his own experience. Gradually, he became convinced that his family's poverty and alienation were not their fault, but were the result of not being aware of their rights, of not knowing the rules of the game, of not having effective representation among those who had power. He decided to become a lawyer, not only to better his own life, but to make certain that injustices such as he had suffered would not occur so easily again to others in his position. Once he had set this goal for himself, his resolution was unwavering. He was accepted into law school, clerked for a famous justice, became a judge himself, and at the zenith of his career spent years in the cabinet helping the president develop stronger civil rights policies and legislation to help the disadvantaged. Until the end of his life, his thoughts, actions, and feelings were unified by the theme he had chosen as a teenager. Whatever he did to the end of his days was part of one great game, held together by goals and rules he had agreed to abide by. He felt his life had meaning and enjoyed confronting the challenges that came his way. E's example illustrates several common characteristics of how people forge discovered life themes. In the first place, the theme is in many cases a reaction to a great personal hurt suffered in early life, to being orphaned, abandoned, or treated unjustly. But what matters is not the trauma per se. The external event never determines what the theme will be. What matters is the interpretation that one places on the suffering. If a father is a violent alcoholic, his children have several options for explaining what is wrong. They can tell themselves that the father is a bastard who deserves to die, that he is a man, and all men are weak and violent, that poverty is the cause of the father's affliction, and the only way to avoid his fate is to become rich, that a large part of his behavior is due to helplessness and lack of education. Only the last of these equally likely explanations leads in the direction of a life theme such as E was able to develop. So the next question is, what kinds of explanations for one's suffering lead to negentropic life themes? If a child abused by a violent father concluded that the problem was inherent in human nature, that all men were weak and violent, there would not be much he or she could do about it. How could a child change human nature? To find purpose in suffering, one must interpret it as a possible challenge. In this case, by formulating his problem as being due to the helplessness of disenfranchised minorities, and not to his father's faults, E was able to develop appropriate skills, his legal training, to confront the challenges he saw at the root of what had been wrong in his personal life. What transforms the consequences of a traumatic event into a challenge that gives meaning to life is what in the previous chapter was called a dissipative structure, or the ability to draw order from disorder. Finally, a complex, Negentropic life theme is rarely formulated as the response to just a personal problem. Instead, the challenge becomes generalized to other people or to mankind as a whole. For example, in E's case, he attributed the problem of helplessness not only to himself or to his own family, but to all poor immigrants in the same situation as his parents had been. Thus, whatever solution he found to his own problems would benefit not only himself, but many others besides. This altruistic way of generalizing solutions is typical of negentropic life themes. It brings harmony to the lives of many. Gottfried, another one of the men interviewed by our University of Chicago team, provides a similar example. As a child, Gottfried was very close to his mother, and his memories of those early years are sunny and warm. But before he turned 10, his mother developed cancer and died in great pain. The young boy could have felt sorry for himself and become depressed, or he could have adopted hardened cynicism as a defense. Instead, he began to think of the disease as his personal enemy and swore to defeat it. In time, he earned a medical degree and became a research oncologist, and the results of his work have become part of the pattern of knowledge that eventually will free mankind of this scourge. In this case, again, a personal tragedy became transformed into a challenge that can be met. In developing skills to meet that challenge, the individual improves the lives of other people. Ever since Freud, psychologists have been interested in explaining how early childhood trauma leads to adult psychic dysfunction. This line of causation is fairly easy to understand. More difficult to explain, and more interesting, is the opposite outcome. The instances when suffering gives a person the incentive to become a great artist, a wise statesman, or a scientist. If one assumes that external events must determine psychic outcomes, then it makes sense to see the neurotic response to suffering as normal and the constructive response as defense or sublimation. But if one assumes that people have a choice in how they respond to external events, in what meaning they attribute to suffering, then one can interpret the constructive response as normal and the neurotic one as a failure to rise to the challenge, as a breakdown in the ability to flow. What makes some people able to develop a coherent purpose, while others struggle through an empty or meaningless life? There is no simple answer, of course, because whether a person will discover a harmonious theme in the apparent chaos of experience is influenced by many factors, both internal and external. It is easier to doubt that life makes sense if one is born deformed, poor, and oppressed. But even here, this is not inevitably the case. Antonio Gramsci, the philosopher of humane socialism and a man who left a profound mark on recent European thought, was born a hunchback in a miserable peasant hovel. As he was growing up, his father was jailed for many years, unjustly as it turned out, and the family could barely survive from day to day. Antonio was so sickly as a child that for years his mother is said to have dressed him in his best clothes every evening and laid him out to sleep in a coffin, expecting him to be dead by morning. Altogether, it was not a very promising start. Yet despite these and many other handicaps, Gramsci struggled to survive and even succeeded in getting himself an education. And he did not stop when he achieved a modest security as a teacher. For he had decided that what he really wanted from life was to struggle against the social conditions that broke his mother's health and destroyed his father's honor. He ended up being a university professor, a deputy in parliament, and one of the most fearless leaders against fascism. Until the very end, before he finally died in one of Mussolini's prisons, he wrote beautiful essays about the wonderful world that could be ours if we stopped being fearful and greedy. There are so many examples of this type of personality that one certainly cannot assume a direct causal relation between external disorder in childhood and internal lack of meaning later in life. Thomas Edison as a child was sickly, poor, and believed to be retarded by his teacher. Eleanor Roosevelt was a lonely, neurotic young girl. Albert Einstein's early years were filled with anxieties and disappointments. Yet they all ended up inventing powerful and useful lives for themselves. If there is a strategy shared by these and by other people who succeed in building meaning into their experience, it is one so simple and obvious that it is almost embarrassing to mention. Yet because it is so often overlooked, especially nowadays, it will be valuable to review it. The strategy consists in extracting from the order achieved by past generations patterns that will help avoid disorder in one's own mind. There is much knowledge or well-ordered information accumulated in culture ready for this use. Great music, architecture, art, poetry, drama, dance, philosophy, and religion are there for anyone to see as examples of how harmony can be imposed on chaos. Yet so many people ignore them, expecting to create meaning in their lives by their own devices. To do so is like trying to build up material culture from scratch in each generation. No one in his right mind would want to start reinventing the wheel, fire, electricity, and the million objects and processes that we now take for granted as part of the human environment. Instead, we learn how to make these things by receiving ordered information from teachers, from books, from models, so as to benefit from the knowledge of the past and eventually surpass it. To discard the hard-won information on how to live accumulated by our ancestors, or to expect to discover a viable set of goals all by oneself is misguided hubris. The chances of success are about as good as in trying to build an electron microscope without the tools and knowledge of physics. People who as adults develop coherent life themes often recall that when they were very young, their parents told them stories and read from books. When told by a loving adult whom one trusts, fairy tales, biblical stories, heroic historical deeds, and poignant family events are often the first intimations of meaningful order a person gleans from the experience of the past. In contrast, we found in our studies that individuals who never focus on any goal or accept one unquestioningly from the society around them tend not to remember their parents having read or told stories to them as children. Saturday morning kiddie shows on television, with their pointless sensationalism, are unlikely to achieve the same purpose. Whatever one's background, there are still many opportunities later on in life to draw meaning from the past. Most people who discover complex life themes remember either an older person or a historical figure whom they greatly admired and who served as a model, or they recall having read a book that revealed new possibilities for action. For instance, a now famous social scientist, widely respected for his integrity, tells how, when he was in his early teens, he read A Tale of Two Cities and was so impressed by the social and political chaos Dickens described, which echoed the turmoil his parents had experienced in Europe after World War I, that he decided then and there that he would spend his life trying to understand why people made life miserable for one another. Another young boy, reared in a harsh orphanage, thought to himself, after reading by chance a Horatio Alger story in which a similarly poor and lonely youth makes his way in life by dint of hard work and good luck, if he could do it, why not me? Today, this person is a retired banker, well known for his philanthropy. Others remember being changed forever by the rational order of the Platonic dialogues or by the courageous acts of characters in a science fiction story. At its best, literature contains ordered information about behavior, models of purpose, and examples of lives successfully patterned around meaningful goals. Many people confronted with the randomness of existence have drawn hope from the knowledge that others before them had faced similar problems and had been able to prevail. And this is just literature. What about music, art, philosophy, and religion? Occasionally, I run a seminar for business managers on the topic of how to handle the midlife crisis. Many of these successful executives, having risen as far as they are likely to advance in their organizations, and often with their family and private lives in disarray, welcome the opportunity to spend some time thinking about what they want to do next. For years, I have relied on the best theories and research results in developmental psychology for the lectures and discussions. I was reasonably content with how these seminars worked out, and the participants usually felt that they had learned something useful. But I was never quite satisfied that the material made enough sense. Finally, it occurred to me to try something more unusual. One would begin the seminar with a quick review of Dante's Divina Commedia. After all, written over 600 years ago, this was the earliest description I knew of a midlife crisis and its resolution. In the middle of the journey of our life, writes Dante in the first line of his enormously long and rich poem, I found myself inside a dark forest, for the right way I had completely lost. What happens afterward is a gripping and in many ways still relevant account of the difficulties to be encountered in middle age. First of all, wandering in the dark forest, Dante realizes that three fierce beasts are stalking him, licking their chops in anticipation. They are a lion, a lynx, and a she-wolf, representing, among other things, ambition, lust, and greed. As for the contemporary protagonist of one of the bestsellers of 1988, the middle-aged New York bond trader in Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities, Dante's nemesis turns out to be the desire for power, sex, and money. To avoid being destroyed by them, Dante tries to escape by climbing a hill. But the beasts keep drawing nearer, and in desperation, Dante calls for divine help. His prayer is answered by an apparition. It is the ghost of Virgil, a poet who died more than 1,000 years before Dante was born, but whose wise and majestic verse Dante admired so much that he thought of the poet as his mentor. Virgil tries to reassure Dante. The good news is that there is a way out of the dark forest. The bad news is that the way leads through hell. And through hell they slowly wend their way, witnessing as they go the sufferings of those who had never chosen a goal, and the even worse fate of those whose purpose in life had been to increase entropy, the so-called sinners. I was rather concerned about how the harried business executives would take to this centuries-old parable. Chances were, I feared, that they would regard it as a waste of their precious time. I need not have worried. We never had as open and as serious a discussion of the pitfalls of midlife and of the options for enriching the years that would follow as we had after talking about the Commedia. Later, several participants told me privately that starting the seminar with Dante had been a great idea. His story focused the issues so clearly that it became much easier to think and to talk about them afterward. Dante is an important model for another reason as well. Although his poem is informed by a deep religious ethic, it is very clear to anyone who reads it that Dante's Christianity is not an accepted but a discovered belief. In other words, the religious life theme he created was made up of the best insights of Christianity combined with the best of Greek philosophy and Islamic wisdom that had filtered into Europe. At the same time, his Inferno is densely populated with popes, cardinals, and clerics suffering eternal damnation. Even his first guide, Virgil, is not a Christian saint, but a heathen poet. Dante recognized that every system of spiritual order, when it becomes incorporated into a worldly structure like an organized church, begins to suffer the effects of entropy. So to extract meaning from a system of beliefs, a person must first compare the information contained in it with his or her concrete experience, retain what makes sense, and then reject the rest. These days, we occasionally still meet people whose lives reveal an inner order based on the spiritual insights of the great religions of the past. Despite what we read every day about the immorality of the stock market, the corruption of defense contractors, and the lack of principles in politicians, examples to the contrary do exist. Thus, there are also successful businessmen who spend some of their free time in hospitals keeping company with dying patients because they believe that reaching out to people who suffer is a necessary part of a meaningful life. And many people continue to derive strength and serenity from prayer, people for whom a personally meaningful belief system provides goals and rules for intense flow experiences. But it seems clear that an increasing majority are not being helped by traditional religions and belief systems. Many are unable to separate the truth in the old doctrines from the distortions and degradations that time has added. And since they cannot accept error, they reject the truth as well. Others are so desperate for some order that they cling rigidly to whatever belief happens to be at hand, warts and all, and become fundamentalist Christians, or Muslims, or communists. Is there any possibility that a new system of goals and means will arise to help give meaning to the lives of our children in the next century? Some people are confident that Christianity restored to its former glory will answer that need. Some still believe that communism will solve the problem of chaos in human experience, and that its order will spread across the world. At present, neither of these outcomes seems likely. If a new faith is to capture our imagination, it must be one that will account rationally for the things we know, the things we feel, the things we hope for, and the ones we dread. It must be a system of beliefs that will marshal our psychic energy toward meaningful goals, a system that provides rules for a way of life that can provide flow. It is difficult to imagine that a system of beliefs such as this will not be based, at least to some degree, on what science has revealed about humanity and about the universe. Without such a foundation, our consciousness would remain split between faith and knowledge. But if science is to be of real help, it will have to transform itself. In addition to the various specialized disciplines aimed at describing and controlling isolated aspects of reality, it will have to develop an integrated interpretation of all that is known and relate it to humankind and its destiny. One way to accomplish this is through the concept of evolution. Everything that matters most to us, such questions as, where did we come from? Where are we going? What powers shape our lives? What is good and bad? How are we related to one another and to the rest of the universe? What are the consequences of our actions? Could be discussed in a systematic way in terms of what we now know about evolution, and even more in terms of what we are going to know about it in the future. The obvious critique of this scenario is that science in general, and the science of evolution in particular, deals with what is, not with what ought to be. Faiths and beliefs, on the other hand, are not limited by actuality. They deal with what is right, what is desirable. But one of the consequences of an evolutionary faith might be precisely a closer integration between the is and the ought. When we understand better why we are as we are, when we appreciate more fully the origins of instinctual drives, social controls, cultural expressions, all the elements that contribute to the formation of consciousness, it will become easier to direct our energies where they ought to go. And the evolutionary perspective also points to a goal worthy of our energies. There seems to be no question about the fact that over the billions of years of activity on the Earth, more and more complex life forms have made their appearance, culminating in the intricacies of the human nervous system. In turn, the cerebral cortex has evolved consciousness, which now envelops the Earth as thoroughly as the atmosphere does. The reality of complexification is both an is and an ought. It has happened. Given the conditions ruling the Earth, it was bound to happen, but it might not continue unless we wish it to go on. The future of evolution is now in our hands. In the past few thousand years, a mere split second in evolutionary time, humanity has achieved incredible advances in the differentiation of consciousness. We have developed a realization that mankind is separate from other forms of life. We have conceived of individual human beings as separate from one another. We have invented abstraction and analysis, the ability to separate dimensions of objects and processes from each other, such as the velocity of a falling object from its weight and its mass. It is this differentiation that has produced science, technology, and the unprecedented power of mankind to build up and to destroy its environment. But complexity consists of integration as well as differentiation. The task of the next decades and centuries is to realize this underdeveloped component of the mind. Just as we have learned to separate ourselves from each other and from the environment, we now need to learn how to reunite ourselves with other entities around us without losing our hard-won individuality. The most promising faith for the future might be based on the realization that the entire universe is a system related by common laws and that it makes no sense to impose our dreams and desires on nature without taking them into account. Recognizing the limitations of human will, accepting a cooperative rather than a ruling role in the universe, we should feel the relief of the exile who is finally returning home. The problem of meaning will then be resolved as the individual's purpose merges with the universal flow. Notes Chapter 1, page Happiness. Aristotle's views of happiness are most clearly developed in 1. The Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, and Book 9, Chapters 9 and 10. Contemporary research on happiness by psychologists and other social scientists started relatively late, but has recently begun to catch up with this important topic in earnest. One of the first, and still very influential works in this field, has been Norman Bradburn's The Structure of Psychological Well-Being, Bradburn 1969, which pointed out that happiness and unhappiness were independent of each other. In other words, just because a person is happy, it does not mean he can't also, be unhappy at the same time. Dr. Ruud Veenhoven at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, has recently published a data book of happiness, which summarizes 245 surveys conducted in 32 countries between 1911 and 1975, Veenhoven 1984. A second volume is in preparation. The Archimedes Foundation of Toronto, Canada, has also set as its task the keeping track of investigations of human happiness and well-being. Its first directory appeared in 1988. The Psychology of Happiness by the Oxford social psychologist Michael Argyll was published in 1987. Another comprehensive collection of ideas and research in this area is the volume by Strack, Argyll, Schwartz, 1990, Undreamed of Material Luxuries. Good recent accounts of the conditions of everyday life in past centuries can be found in a series under the general editorship of Philippe Aries and Georges Duby, entitled A History of Private Life. The first volume, From Pagan Rome to Byzantium, edited by Paul Vane, was published here in 1987. Another magisterial series on the same topic is Fernand Braudel's The Structures of Everyday Life, whose first volume appeared in English in 1981. For the changes in home furnishings, see also Leroy Ladurie, 1979, and Csikszentmihalyi and Rochberg-Halton, 1981. 4. Flow. My work on optimal experience began with my doctoral dissertation, which involved a study of how young artists went about creating a painting. Some of the results were reported in the book The Creative Vision, Getzels and Csikszentmihalyi, 1976. Since then, several dozen scholarly articles have appeared on the subject. The first book that described the flow experience directly was Beyond Boredom and Anxiety, Csikszentmihalyi, 1975. The latest summary of the academic research on the flow experience was collected in the edited volume Optimal Experience, Psychological Studies of Flow and Consciousness, Csikszentmihalyi and Csikszentmihalyi, 1988. Experience Sampling Method. I first used this technique in a study of adult workers in 1976. The first publication concerned a study of adolescents, Csikszentmihalyi, Larson, and Prescott, 1977. Detailed descriptions of the method are available in Csikszentmihalyi and Larson, 1984-1987. 5. Applications of the flow concept. These are described in the first chapter of Optimal Experience, Csikszentmihalyi and Csikszentmihalyi, 1988. 6. Goals. The earliest explanations of human behavior, starting with Aristotle, assumed that actions were motivated by goals. Modern psychology, however, has shown that much of what people do can be explained more parsimoniously by simpler, often unconscious causes. As a result, the importance of goals in directing behavior has been greatly discredited. Some exceptions include Alfred Adler, 1956, who believed that people develop goal hierarchies that inform their decisions throughout life, and the American psychologist Gordon Allport, 1955, and Abraham Maslow, 1968, who believed that after more basic needs are satisfied, goals may begin to be effective in directing actions. Goals have also regained some credibility in cognitive psychology, where researchers such as Miller, Galanter, and Pribram, 1960, Mandler, 1975, Neisser, 1976, and MD, 1980, have used the concept to explain decision-making sequences and the regulation of behavior. I do not claim that most people most of the time act the way they do because they are trying to achieve goals, but only that when they do so, they experience a sense of control which is absent when behavior is not motivated by consciously chosen goals. See Csikszentmihalyi, 1989. Chaos. It might seem strange that a book which deals with optimal experience should be concerned with the chaos of the universe. The reason for this is that the value of life cannot be understood except against the background of its problems and dangers. Ever since the first known work of literature, the Gilgamesh, was written 35 centuries ago, Mason 1971, it has been customary to start with a review of the fall before venturing to suggest ways to improve the human condition. Perhaps the best prototype is Dante's Divina Commedia, where the reader first has to pass through the gates of hell, per me si va, nedimo dolore, before he or she can contemplate a solution to the predicaments of life. In this context, we are following these illustrious exemplars, not because of a sense of tradition, but because it makes good sense psychologically. Hierarchy of needs. The best-known formulation of the relationship between lower-order needs such as survival and safety and higher goals like self-actualization is the one by Abraham Maslow, 1968-1971. Escalating expectations. According to many authors, chronic dissatisfaction with the status quo is a feature of modernity. The quintessential modern man, Goethe's Faust, was given power by the devil on condition that he never be satisfied with what he has. A good recent treatment of this theme can be found in Berman, 1982. It is more likely, however, that hankering for more than what one has is a fairly universal human trait, probably connected with the development of consciousness. That happiness and satisfaction with life depend on how small a gap one perceives between what one wishes for and what one possesses, and that expectations tend to rise have been often observed. For instance, in a poll conducted in 1987 and reported in the Chicago Tribune, September 24, Sect 1, p. 3, Americans making more than $100,000 a year, who constitute 2% of the population, believe that to live in comfort they would need $88,000 a year. Those who earn less think $30,000 would be sufficient. The more affluent also said that they would need $250,000 to fulfill their dreams, while the price tag on the average American's dream was only 1/5 that sum. Of the scholars who have been studying the quality of life, many have reported similar findings, e.g. Campbell, Converse, and Rogers, 1976, Davis, 1959, Lewin et al., 1944, 1962, Martin, 1981, McCallus, 1985, and Williams, 1975. These approaches, however, tend to focus on the extrinsic conditions of happiness, such as health, financial affluence, and so on. The approach of this book is concerned instead with happiness that results from a person's actions. Controlling one's life. The effort to achieve self-control is one of the oldest goals of human psychology. In a lucid summary of several hundred writings of different intellectual traditions aimed at increasing self-control, e.g. yoga, various philosophies, psychoanalysis, personality psychology, self-help, Klausner, 1965, found that the objects to which control was directed could be summarized in 4 categories. 1. Control of performance or behavior. 2. Control of underlying physiological drives. 3. Control of intellectual functions, i.e. thinking. 4. Control of emotions, i.e. feeling. 11. Culture as defense against chaos. See, for instance, Nelson's 1965 summary on this point. Interesting treatments of the positive integrative effects of culture are Ruth Benedict's concept of synergy, Maslow-Paun-Honigman, 1970, and Laszlo's 1970 general systems perspective. See also Redfield, 1942, von Bertalanffy, 1960-1968, and Polanyi, 1968-1969. For an example of how meaning is created by individuals in a cultural context, see Csikszentmihalyi and Rochberg-Halton, 1981. Cultures believe themselves to be at the center of the universe. Ethnocentrism tends to be one of the basic tenets of every culture. See, for instance, Levine and Campbell, 1972, Csikszentmihalyi, 1973. 12. Ontological anxiety. The experts on ontological or existential anxiety have been, at least in the past few centuries, the poets, the painters, the playwrights, and other sundry artists. Among philosophers, one must mention Kierkegaard, 1944, 1954, Heidegger, 1962, Sartre, 1956, and Jaspers, 1923, 1955. Among psychiatrists, Sullivan, 1953, and Lang, 1960, 1961. Meaning. An experience is meaningful when it is related positively to a person's goals. Life has meaning when we have a purpose that justifies our strivings, and when experience is ordered. To achieve this order in experience, it is often necessary to posit some supernatural force or providential plan, without which life might make no sense. See also Csikszentmihalyi and Rochberg-Halton, 1981. The problem of meaning will be discussed in more depth in Chapter 10. 14. Religion and the loss of meaning. That religion still helps as a shield against chaos is shown by several studies that report higher satisfaction with life among adults who report themselves as being religious, B. 1987, p. 373. But there have been several claims made recently to the effect that the cultural values which sustained our society are no longer as effective as they once were. For example, see Daniel Bell, 1976. on the decline of capitalistic values, and Robert Bellah, 1975, on the decline of religion. At the same time, it is clear that even the so-called Age of Faith in Europe during the entire Middle Ages was beset by doubt and confusion. For the spiritual turmoil of those times, see the excellent accounts of Johann Huizinga, 1954, and Leroy Ladurie, 1979. 15 Trends in Social Pathology. For the statistics on energy use, see Statistical Abstracts of the U.S. Dept of Commerce 1985, p. 199. For those on poverty, see IBID, p. 457. Violent crime trends are drawn from the U.S. Dept of Justice's Uniform Crime Reports, July 25, 1987, p. 41, the Statistical Abstracts, 1985, p. 166, and the Commerce Department's U.S. Social Indicators, 1980, p. 235-241. Venereal disease statistics are from the Statistical Abstracts of the U.S., 1985, p. 155. For divorce, see IBID, p. 88. Mental health figures are from the U.S. Social Indicators, p. 93. The budget figures are from the U.S. Statistical 1985, p. 332. For information on the number of adolescents living in two-parent families, see Brandwein 1977, Cooper 1970, Glick 1979, and Weitzman 1978. For crime statistics, see U.S. Statistical Abstracts 1985, p. 189. Adolescent pathology. For suicide and homicide among teenagers, see Vital Statistics of the United States 1985, U.S. Dept of Health and Human Services 1988, Table 8.5. Changes in SAT scores are reported in the U.S. Statistical Abstracts 1985, p. 147. According to reliable estimates, teenage suicide increased by about 300% between 1950 and 1980, with the heaviest losses among the privileged cohorts of white, middle-class, male adolescents, Social Indicators 1981. The same patterns are shown for crime, homicide, illegitimate pregnancies, venereal diseases, and psychosomatic complaints. Wynn 1978, Yankelevich 1981. By 1980, 1 out of 10 high school seniors was using psychotropic drugs daily, Johnston, Bachman, and O'Malley 1981. To qualify this picture of gloom, it should be mentioned that in most cultures, as far as it is possible to ascertain, adolescents have been seen as troublesome, Fox 1977. The great internal turmoil and external disorder of adolescence are universal and only moderately affected by cultural determinants. Keel, 1969, p. 9. According to Offer, Ostrov, and Howard, 1981, only about 20% of contemporary U.S. adolescents are to be considered troubled, but even this conservative estimate represents, of course, quite a huge number of young people. Socialization. The necessity to postpone gratification in order to function in society was discussed by Freud in Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930. Brown, 1959, provided a spirited rebuttal of Freud's arguments. For standard works on socialization, see Clausen, 1968, and Ziegler and Child, 1973. A recent extended study of socialization in adolescence can be found in Csikszentmihalyi and Larson, 1984. Social controls. Some good examples of how social controls are enforced by creating chemical dependencies are the case of the Spaniards' introduction of rum and brandy into Central America, Braudel 1981, pp. 248-49, the use of whiskey in the expropriation of American Indian territories, and the Chinese Opium Wars. Herbert Marcuse, 1955-1964, has discussed extensively how dominant social groups co-opt sexuality and pornography to enforce social controls. As Aristotle said long ago, the study of pleasure and pain belongs to the province of the political philosopher. Nicomachean Ethics, Book 7, Chapter 11. Genes and personal advantage. The argument that genes were programmed for their own benefit and not to make life better for their carriers was first formulated in a coherent way by Dawkins, 1976, although the saying, "the chicken is only an egg's way for making another egg," which encapsulates Dawkins' idea very well, is much older. For another view of this matter, see Csikszentmihalyi and Massimini, 1985, and Csikszentmihalyi, 1988. 20 Paths of Liberation. The history of this quest is so rich and long that it is impossible to do it justice in a short space. For the mystical traditions, see Behanon, 1937, and Wood, 1954, on yoga, and Sholem, 1969, on Jewish mysticism. In philosophy, one might single out Hadas, 1960, on Greek humanism, Arnold, 1911, and Murray, 1940, on the Stoics, and MacVannel, 1896, on Hegel. For more contemporary philosophers, see Tillich, 1952, and Sartre, 1956. A recent reinterpretation of Aristotle's notion of virtue that is very similar in some ways to the concept of autotelic activity, or flow, presented here can be found in the work of Alistair MacIntyre, 1984. In history, Cauchy, 1962, Toynbee, 1934, and Berdyaev, 1952, stand out. In sociology, Marx, 1844-1956, Durkheim, 1897-1912, Sorokin, 1956-1967, and Gouldner, 1968. In psychology, Angial, 1941-1965, Maslow, 1968-1970, and Rogers, 1951. In anthropology, see Benedict, 1934, Mead, 1964, and Geertz, 1973. This is just an idiosyncratic selection among a huge array of possible choices. Control of consciousness. Control of consciousness, as developed in this chapter, includes all four manifestations of self-control reviewed by Klausner, 1965, and listed in the note to page 10. One of the oldest known techniques for achieving such controls are the various yogi disciplines developed in India roughly 1,500 years ago. These will be discussed more amply in Chapter 5. Followers of holistic medicine believe that the mental state of the patient is extremely important in determining the course of physical health. See also Cousins, 1979, and Siegel, 1986. Eugene Gendlin, 1981, a colleague at the University of Chicago, has developed a contemporary technique for controlling attention called focusing. In this volume, I am not proposing any one technique, but instead will present a conceptual analysis of what control and enjoyment involve, as well as give practical examples, so that the reader can develop a method best suited to his or her inclinations and conditions. 21. Routinization. The argument here is, of course, reminiscent of Weber's 1922 notion of routinization of charisma, developed in his work The Social Psychology of World Religions, and of the even earlier Hegelian idea that the world of the spirit eventually turns into the world of nature, e.g., Sorokin, 1950. The same concept is developed from a sociological viewpoint by Berger and Luckman, 1967. Page, consciousness. This concept has been central to many religious and 23 philosophical systems, e.g., those of Kant and Hegel. Early psychologists 24 like Ach, 1905, have tried to define it in modern scientific terms with little success. For several decades, behavioral sciences had abandoned the notion of consciousness altogether because self-reports of internal states were held to lack scientific validity. Some recent renewal of interest in the topic can be discerned Pope and Singer, 1978. Historical summaries of the concept can be found in Boring, 1953, and Klausner, 1965. Smith, 1969, who coined the term introspective behaviorism, gives a definition which is very close to the one used in this volume. Conscious experience is an internal event about which one does do directly what one wants to do. Smith, 1969, p. 108. Otherwise, however, there is little overlap between the concept as developed here and that of either Smith or any other behaviorally oriented psychologist. The main difference is that my emphasis is on the subjective dynamics of experience and on its phenomenological primacy. A fuller definition of consciousness will be provided in the later sections of this chapter. 25. Phenomenology. The term phenomenological is not used here to 26 denote adherence to the tenets or methods of any particular thinker or school. It only means that the approach to the problem of studying experience is heavily influenced by the insights of Husserl, 1962, Heidegger, 1962-1967, Sartre, 1956, Merleau-Ponty, 1962-1964, and some of their translators into the social sciences, e.g. Nathanson, 1963, Gendlin, 1962, Fischer, 1969, Wan, 1964, and Schutz, 1962. Clear, short introductions to the phenomenology of Husserl are the books by Kohak, 1978, and Kolakowski, 1987. To follow this volume, however, There is no need to keep in mind any phenomenological assumption. The argument must stand on its own merits and be understood on its own terms. The same is true for information theory, see Wiener 1948, 1961. 26. Dreaming. Stewart 1972 reports that the Sinoi of Malaysia learn to control their dreams and thereby achieve unusual mastery over waking consciousness as well. If this is true, which seems doubtful, it is an interesting exception that goes toward proving the general rule. In other words, it means that by training attention one can control consciousness even in sleep. Csikszentmihalyi 1982a. One recent consciousness expansion method has been trying to do just this. Lucid dreaming is an attempt to control thought processes in sleep. LaBerge 1985. 28. Limits of consciousness. The first general statement about the number of bits that can be processed simultaneously was by Miller, 1956. Orm, 1969, on the basis of von Uexkull's 1957 calculations, has figured that lash is of a second is the threshold of discrimination. Cognitive scientists who have treated the limitations of attention include Simon, 1969-1978, Kahneman, 1973, Hasher and Zaks, 1979, Eysenck, 1982, and Hoffman, Nelson, and Hauck, 1983. Attentional demands made by cognitive processes are discussed by Neisser, 1967-1976, Treisman and Gilade, 1980, and Treisman and Schmidt, 1982. The attentional requirements of storing and recalling information from memory have been dealt with by Atkinson and Shiffrin, 1968, and Hasher S. Zaks, 1979. But the importance of attention and its limitations was already well known to William James, 1890. 29. Limits for processing speech. For the 40-bit per second requirements, see Liberman, Mattingly, and Turvey, 1972, and Nussbaum and Schwab, 1986. The uses of time. The first comprehensive tabulation of how people spend their time was the Cross-National Project reported in Salai, 1965. The figures reported here are based on my studies with the Experience Sampling Method, ESM, e.g. Csikszentmihalyi, Larson, and Prescott, 1977, Csikszentmihalyi and Grafe, 1980, Csikszentmihalyi and Larson, 1984, Csikszentmihalyi and Csikszentmihalyi, 1988. 30. Television watching. The feelings people report while watching television are compared to experiences in other activities in ESM studies by Csikszentmihalyi, Larson, and Prescott, 1977, Csikszentmihalyi and Kubi, 1981, Larson and Kubi, 1983, and Kubi and Csikszentmihalyi in Press. Psychic energy. The processes taking place in consciousness, thoughts, emotions, will, and memory have been described by philosophers since the earliest times, and by some of the earliest psychologists, e.g. Ack 1905. For a review, see Hilgard 1980. Energistic approaches to consciousness include Wundt 1902, Lips 1899, Reibout 1890, Binet 1890, and Young 1928 I-960. Some contemporary approaches are represented by Kahneman 1973, Csikszentmihalyi 1978-1987, and Hoffman, Nelson, Hauck 1983. 33. Attention and culture. The Melanesians' ability to remember precise locations by floating on the surface of the sea is described by Gladwin, 1970. Reference to the many names for snow used by Eskimos can be found in Bourguignon, 1979. The self. Psychologists have thought of innumerable ways of describing the self, from the social psychological approaches of George Herbert Mead, 1934-1970, and Sullivan, 1953, to the analytic psychology of Carl Gustav Jung, 1933-1961. Currently, however, psychologists try to avoid speaking of the self. Instead, they limit themselves to describing the self concept. A good account of how this concept develops is given by Damon and Hart, 1982. Another approach uses the term self-efficacy. See Bandura, 1982. The model of the self developed in these pages has been influenced by many sources and is described in Csikszentmihalyi 1985a and Csikszentmihalyi and Csikszentmihalyi 1988. 36. Disorder in consciousness. Psychologists have studied negative emotions such as anger, distress, sadness, fear, shame, contempt, or disgust very extensively. Ekman, 1972, Frieda, 1986, Izard, Kagan, and Zajonc, 1984, and Tompkins, 1962. But these investigators generally assume that each emotion is separately wired in the central nervous system as a response to a specific set of stimuli, instead of being an integrated response of the self system. Clinical psychologists and psychiatrists are familiar with dysphoric moods, such as anxiety and depression, which interfere with concentration and normal functioning. Beck, 1976, Bloomberg and Izard, 1985, Hamilton, 1982, Lewinson and Libet, 1972, Seligman et al., 1984. 39. Order. What order or psychic negentropy implies will be discussed in the pages below. See also Csikszentmihalyi, 1982a. And Csikszentmihalyi Larson, 1984. Basically, it refers to the lack of conflict among the bits of information present in an individual's consciousness. When the information is in harmony with a person's goals, the consciousness of that person is ordered. The same concept applies also to lack of conflict between individuals when their goals are in harmony with each other. Flow. The original research and the theoretical model of the flow experience were first fully reported in Beyond Boredom and Anxiety, Csikszentmihalyi, 1975. Since then, a great number of works have used the flow concept, and extensive new research has been accumulating. A few examples are Victor Turner's, 1974, application of the concept to anthropology, Mitchell's, 1983, to sociology, and Crook's, 1980, to evolution. Ekblad, 1981, Amabel, 1983, and Desayan Ryan, 1985, have used it in developing motivational theories. For summaries of the various research findings, see Massimini and Ingiluri, 1986, and Csikszentmihalyi and Csikszentmihalyi, 1988. It's exhilarating. The quote is from Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, p. 95. Complexity. Complexity. Complexity is a function of how well the information in a person's consciousness is differentiated and integrated. A complex person is one who is able to access precise, discrete information, and yet is able to relate the various pieces to each other. For example, a person whose desires, emotions, thoughts, values, and actions are strongly individuated, yet do not contradict each other. See, for instance, Csikszentmihalyi, 1970, Csikszentmihalyi and Csikszentmihalyi, 1988, and Csikszentmihalyi and Larson, 1984. The notion of complexity used here is related to the same concept as used by some evolutionary biologists, e.g. Dobzhansky, 1962-1967, and it has been influenced by the poetic insights of Teilhard de Chardin, 1965. A very promising definition of complexity in physical systems, defined as thermodynamic depth, was being worked on by Heinz Pagels, 1988, before his recent untimely death. By his definition, the complexity of a system is the difference between the amount of information needed to describe the system in its present state and the amount needed to describe all the states it might have been in at the point at which it changed from the last previous state. Applying this to the psychology of the self, one might say that a complex person was one whose behavior and ideas could not be easily explained, and whose development was not obviously predictable. There's no place. The quote is from Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, p. 94. Chapter 3 page for research on the relationship between happiness and wealth, 44 C. Diener, Horowitz, and Emmons, 1985, Bradburn, 1969, and Campbell, Converse, and Rogers, 1976. 45. Pleasure and enjoyment. Aristotle's entire Nicomachean Ethics deals with this issue, especially Book 3, Chapter 11, and Book 7. See also Csikszentmihalyi and Csikszentmihalyi, 1988, pp. 24-25. 47. Children's pleasure in activity. Early German psychologists posited the existence of Funktionlust, or the pleasure derived from using one's body in such activities as running, hitting, swinging, and so on. Groos, 1901, Buhler, 1930. Later Jean Piaget, 1952. Declared that one of the sensory motor stages of an infant's physical development was characterized by the pleasure of being the cause. In the U.S., Murphy, 1947, posited the existence of sensory and activity drives to account for the feeling of pleasure that sight, sound, or muscle sense occasionally gives. These insights were incorporated into a theory of optimal stimulation or optimal arousal, mainly through the work of Hebb, 1955. and Berline, 1960, who assumed pleasure was the consequence of an optimal balance between the incoming stimulation and the nervous system's ability to assimilate it. The extension of these basically neurological explanations for why one finds pleasure in action was provided by White, 1959, DeCharms, 1968, and Deci and Ryan, 1985, who looked at the same phenomenon but from the point of view of the self, or conscious organism. Their explanations hinge on the fact that action provides pleasure because it gives the person a feeling of competence, efficacy, or autonomy. Learning in adulthood. The importance of learning in later life has received much needed attention lately. For some of the basic ideas in this field, see Mortimer Adler's early statement, Adler 1956, Tuff 1978, and Gross 1982. 48 interviews. Most of the interviews mentioned here were collected in the course of studies reported in Csikszentmihalyi 1975 and Csikszentmihalyi and Csikszentmihalyi 1988. Over 600 additional interviews were collected by Professor Fausto Massimini and his collaborators in Europe, Asia, and the southwestern United States. 49 Ecstasy. Extensive case studies of ecstatic religious experiences were collected by Margarita Lasky, 1962. Abraham Maslow, 1971, who coined the term peak experience to describe such events, played a very important role in helping give legitimacy to the consideration of such phenomena by psychologists. It is fair to say, however, that Lasky and Maslow looked at ecstasy as a fortuitous epiphany that happened more or less by itself, rather than a natural process which could be controlled and cultivated. For a comparison between Maslow's concept of peak experience and flow, see Prevet, 1983. Ecstatic experiences are apparently more common than one might think. As of March 1989, over 30% of a national representative sample of 1,000 U.S. respondents answered affirmatively to the item, "You felt as though you were very close to a powerful spiritual force that seemed to lift you out of yourself." A full 12% claimed that they had experienced this feeling often or on several occasions. General Social Survey, 1989. 49. Reading as a favorite flow activity. This finding is reported in Masfifty Simini, Csikszentmihalyi, and Della Fave, 1988. A recent book that describes in detail how reading provides enjoyment is by Nell, 1988. 50. Socializing as a flow activity. All the studies conducted with the experience sampling method confirm the fact that simply being with other people generally improves a person's mood significantly, regardless of what else is happening. This seems to be as true of teenagers, Csikszentmihalyi and Larson 1984, as of adults, Larson, Csikszentmihalyi and Grafe 1980, and of older people, Larson, Manel, and Zuzanek 1986. But to really enjoy the company of other people requires interpersonal skills. 51. A lot of pieces. The quote is from a study of how fine art museum curators describe the aesthetic experience, Csikszentmihalyi and Robinson in Press, p. 51. Professor Meyer Leibniz described his ingenious way of keeping track of time by tapping his fingers in a personal communication, 1986. 52. The importance of microflow activities was examined in Beyond Boredom and Anxiety, Csikszentmihalyi 1975, pp. 140-78. Those studies showed that if people were asked to do without their usual routines, such as tapping their fingers, doodling, whistling, or joking with friends, within a matter of hours, they would become irritable. Frequently, they would report loss of control and disruption of behavior after only a day of microflow deprivation. Few people were able or willing to do without these small routines for more than 24 hours. 52. The balanced ratio between challenges and skills was recognized 53 from the very beginning as one of the central conditions of the flow experience, e.g. Csikszentmihalyi 1975, 49-54. The original model assumed that enjoyment would occur along the entire diagonal, that is, when challenges and skills were both very low, as well as when they were both very high. Empirical research findings later led to a modification of the model. People did not enjoy situations in which their skills and the outside challenges were both lower than their accustomed levels. The new model predicts flow only when challenges and skills are relatively in balance and above the individual's mean level, and this prediction is confirmed by the studies conducted with the experience sampling method, Carli 1986, Csikszentmihalyi and Nakamura 1989, Massimini, Csikszentmihalyi, and Carli 1987. In addition, these studies have shown that the condition of anxiety, high challenge, low skills, is relatively rare in everyday life, and it is experienced as much more negative than the condition of boredom, low challenge, high skills. 53. Your concentration. You are so involved, and the concentration are from Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, p. 39. Her reading is from Allison and Duncan, 1988, 29. The relationship between focused attention and enjoyment was clearly perceived 4 centuries ago by Montaigne, 1580-1958, p. 853. I enjoy life twice as much as others, for the measure of enjoyment depends on the greater or lesser attention that we lend it. The Mystique of Rock Climbing is from Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, pp. 47-48. 55. I Find Special Satisfaction is from Della Fave and Massimini, 1988, p. 197. I Experienced a Sense of Satisfaction is from Hiscock, 1968, p. 45, and Each Time is from Moitessier, 1971, p. 159. The last two are cited in Macbeth, 1988, p. 228. Nur 55. Painting. The distinction between more and less original artists is that 56, the former start painting with a general and often vague idea of what they want to accomplish, while the latter tend to start with a clearly visualized picture in mind. Thus, original artists must discover as they go along what it is that they will do, using feedback from the developing work to suggest new approaches. The less original artists end up painting the picture in their heads, which has no chance to grow and develop. But to be successful in his open-ended process of creation, the original artist must have well-internalized criteria for what is good art, so that he can choose or discard the right elements in the developing note. Painting, Getzels and Csikszentmihalyi, 1976. 56. Surgery as a flow experience is described in Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, 1985b. 57. Exceptional sensitivities. The common sense impression that different children have a facility for developing different talents, some having an affinity for physical movement, others for music or languages, or for getting along with other people, has recently been formalized in a theory of multiple intelligences by Howard Gardner, 1983. Gardner and his collaborators at Harvard are now at work developing a comprehensive testing battery for each of the 7 major dimensions of intelligence he has identified. The importance of feedback for the blind is reported in Massimini, Csikszentmihalyi, and Della Fave, 1988, pp. 79-80. 58. It is as if is from Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, p. 40. 58. The Court and Kids My Age are from Csikszentmihalyi, 59, 1975, p. 40-41. When You're Climbing is from IBID, p. 81, and I Get a Feeling from IBID, p. 41. But No Matter How Many is from Creolock, 1951, pp. 99-100, quoted in Macbeth, 1988, pp. 221-22. The quotation from Edwin Moses is in Johnson, 1988, p. 6. 59. A strong relaxation and I have a general feeling, 60, are from Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, pp. 44-45. 60. Attraction of risk and danger has been extensively studied by Marvin Zuckerman, 1979, who identified the sensation-seeking personality trait. A more popular treatment of the subject is the recent book by Ralph Keyes, 1985. 61. One of the earliest psychological studies of gambling is the one by Csikszentmihalyi, 1977. That games of chance have developed from the divinatory aspects of religious ceremonials has been argued by Culin, 1906, pp. 32, 37, 43, David, 1962, and Huizinga, 1939, 1970. 62. Morphy and Fisher. The similarity between the careers of these two chess champions who lived a century apart is indeed striking. Paul Charles Morphy, 1837-84, became a chess master in his early teens. When he was 22 years old, he traveled to Europe, where he beat everyone who dared to play against him. After he returned to New York, potential competitors thought he was too good and were afraid to play him even at favorable odds. Deprived of his only source of flow, Morphy became a recluse displaying eccentric and paranoid behavior. For parallels with Bobby Fischer's career, see Waitskin, 1988. There are two lines of explanation for such coincidences. One is that people with fragile psychic organization are disproportionately attracted to chess. The other is that chess, at highly competitive levels, requires a complete commitment of psychic energy and can become addictive. When a player becomes a champion and exhausts all the challenges of the activity into which so much of his attention has been invested, he runs a serious risk of becoming disoriented because the goal that has given order to his consciousness is no longer meaningful. Gambling among American Indians is described by Cullen, 1906, Cushing, 1896, and Cole, 1860. Carver, 1796, p. 238, describes Iroquois playing until they have lost everything they owned, including their moccasins, and then walking back to their home camp in snow 3 feet deep. An observer of the Tarahumara in Mexico reported that he may go on playing stick dice for a fortnight to a month until he has lost everything he has in the world except his wife and children. He draws the line at that. Lumholtz, 1902-1987, p. Pate. Surgeons who claim that performing operations can be addictive are quoted in Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, pp. 138-39. It's a Zen feeling is from Ibid, p. 87. 63, so one forgets oneself is from Moitié, 1971, p. 52, cited in Macbeth, 1988, p. 22. I understand something is from Sato, 1988, p. 113, 64. For the sense of self-transcendence while involved in rock climbing, see Robinson, 1969. While involved in chess, see Steiner, 1974. The danger of losing self as a result of transcendent experience has been extensively written about. One of the earliest treatments of this possibility is by Le Bon, 1895, I-960, whose work influenced that of McDougall, 1920, and Freud, 1921. Some recent studies dealing with the relationship of self-awareness and behavior are by Diener, 1979, Wickland, 1979, and Shire and Carver, 1980. In terms of our model of complexity, a de-individuated person who loses his or herself in a group is integrated, but not differentiated. Such a person yields the control of consciousness to the group and may easily engage in dangerous behavior. To benefit from transcendence, one must also have a strongly differentiated or individuated self. Describing the dialectical relationship between the I, or the active part of the self, and the me, or the reflected self-concept, was the very influential contribution of George Herbert Mead, 1934-1970. 66. Two Things Happen is from Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, p. 116. 67. The essential connection between something like happiness, enjoyment, and even virtue on the one hand, and intrinsic or autotelic rewards on the other, has been generally recognized by thinkers in a variety of cultural traditions. It is essential to the Taoist concept of yu, or right living, e.g., the basic writings of Chuang Tzu, translated by Watson, 1964, to the Aristotelian concept of virtue, McIntyre, 1984, and to the Hindu attitude toward life that infuses the Bhagavad Gita. 68. The generalizations about people being dissatisfied with work and with leisure time are based on our studies with the experience sampling method, e.g., Csikszentmihalyi and Grafe, 1979-1980, Grafe, Csikszentmihalyi, and Giannino, 1983, Csikszentmihalyi and Lefebvre, 1987, 1989, and Lefebvre, 1988. The conclusions are based on the momentary responses adult workers wrote down whenever they were paged at random times on their jobs. When workers respond to large-scale surveys, however, they often tend to give much more favorable global responses. A compilation of 15 studies of job satisfaction carried out between 1972 and 1978 concluded that 3% of U.S. workers are very dissatisfied with their jobs, 9% are somewhat dissatisfied, 36% are somewhat satisfied, and 52% are very satisfied. Argyll, 1987, pp. 31-63. A more recent national survey conducted by Robert Half International and reported in the Chicago Tribune, October 18, 1987, Sec. 8, arrives at much less rosy results. According to this study, 24% of the U.S. workforce, or 1 worker in 4, is quite dissatisfied with his or her job. Our methods of measuring satisfaction may be too stringent, whereas the survey methods are likely to give results that are too optimistic. It should be easy to find out whether a group of people are satisfied or dissatisfied with work. In reality, because satisfaction is such a relative concept, it is very difficult to give an objective answer to this simple question. It is rather like whether one should say half full or half empty when asked to describe a glass with water halfway up or down the container. In a recent book by two outstanding German social scientists, the authors came to diametrically opposed conclusions about German workers' attitudes toward work, one claiming they loved it, the other that they hated it, even though they were both arguing from the same exhaustive and detailed survey database, Noel Newman and Strumpel, 1984. The counterintuitive finding that people tend to rate work as more satisfying than leisure has been noticed by several investigators, e.g. Andrews and Withy, 1976, Robinson, 1977. For example, Veroff, Duvan, and Kulka, 1981, report that 49% of employed men claim work is more satisfying for them than leisure, whereas only 19% say that leisure is more satisfying than work. 69. The dangers of addiction to flow have been dealt with in more detail by Csikszentmihalyi, 1985b. Crime as Flow. A description of how juvenile delinquency can provide flow experiences is given in Csikszentmihalyi and Larson, 1978. The Oppenheimer quote is from Whedon, 1984. 70. Water can be both good and bad. This fragment from Democritus was cited by de Santillana at 1961 at 1970, p. 157. Chapter 4, page play. After Huizinga's Homo Ludens, which first appeared in 1939, 72, perhaps the most seminal book about play and playfulness, has been Roger Caillois' Le Jeu et les Hommes, 1958. 73. Mimicry. An excellent example of how a ritual disguise can help one to step out of ordinary experience is given by Monti, 1969, pp. 915, in his discussion of the use of West African ceremonial masks. From a psychological point of view, the origin of the mask can also be explained by the more atavistic aspiration of the human being to escape from himself in order to be enriched by the experience of different existences, a desire which obviously cannot be fulfilled on the physical level, and in order to increase its own power by identifying with universal divine or demonic forces, whichever they may be. It is a desire to break out of the human constriction of individuals shaped in a specific and immutable mold and closed in a birth-death cycle which leaves no possibility of consciously chosen existential adventures, italics added. 74. Flow and discovery. When asked to rank 16 very different activities as being more or less similar to flow, the groups of highly skilled rock climbers, composers of music, chess players, and so on, studied by Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, p. 29, listed the item designing or discovering something new as being the most similar to their flow activity. 75. Flow and growth. The issue of how flow experiences lead to growth of the self are discussed in Deci and Ryan, 1985, and Csikszentmihalyi, 1982b, 1985a. Ann Wells, 1988, has shown that women who spend more time in flow have a more positive self-concept. 76. Flow and ritual. The anthropologist Victor Turner, 1974, saw the ubiquity of the ritual processes in pre-literate societies as an indication that they were socially sanctioned opportunities to experience flow. Religious rituals in general are usually conducive to the flow experience. See Carrington, 1977, Csikszentmihalyi, 1987I, Csikszentmihalyi, 1988, and Wilson, 1985 and in Press. A good introduction to the historical relationship between the sacred and the secular dimensions of leisure can be found in John R. Kelly's textbook Leisure, 1982, pp. 53-68. Flow and art. A description of how passive visual aesthetic experiences can produce flow is given in Csikszentmihalyi and Robinson in Press. The religious significance of Mayan ball games is described in Blom, 1932, and Gilpin, 1948. Poke to Pock, as this game similar to basketball was called, took place in a stone courtyard, and the aim was for one team to throw the ball through the opponent's stone hoop, placed about 28 feet above the playing field, without touching it with their hands. Father Diego Duran, an early Spanish missionary, gives a vivid description. It was a game of much recreation to them and enjoyment, among which were some who played it with such dexterity and skill that they during 1 hour succeeded in not stopping the flight of the ball from one end to the other without missing a single hit with their buttocks, not being allowed to reach it with hands nor feet, nor with the calf of their legs, nor with their arms. Quoted in Blom, 1932. Apparently, such games sometimes ended in human sacrifices or the killing of the members of the losing team. Pina-chan, 1969. 77. Flow and society. The idea that the kind of flow activities a society made available to its people could reflect something essential about the society itself was first suggested in Csikszentmihalyi, 1981a, 1981b. See also Argyll, 1987, p. 65. The issue of cultural relativism is too complex to be given an unbiased evaluation here. An excellent, but not impartial review of the concept is given by the anthropologist Melford Spiro, 1987, who in a recent autobiographical account describes why he changed his mind from an uncritical acceptance of the equal value of cultural practices to a much more qualified recognition of the pathological forms that cultures can occasionally assume. Philosophers and other humanists have often accused social scientists, sometimes with justification, of debunking absolute values that are important for the survival of culture, e.g., Arendt 1958, Bloom 1987. The early Italian-Swiss sociologist Vilfredo Pareto, 1917-1919, has been one of the scholars most keenly aware of the dangers of relativity inherent in his discipline. Number 78. English workers. The classic story of how the free English workers were 79 transformed into highly regimented industrial laborers is told by the historian E.P. Thompson, 1963. 79. The suspicious Dobuans were studied by the anthropologist Rio Fortune, 1932-1963. For the tragic plight of the Ike of Uganda, see Turnbull, 1972. Yanomamo. This fierce tribe was immortalized by the writings of the anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon, 1979. The sad Nigerian tribe was described by Laura Bohannon under the pseudonym E.S. Bowen, 1954. Colin Turnbull, 1961. Gave a loving description of the pygmies of the Ituri forest. The quote concerning the Shuswap was contained in a 1986 letter from Richard Cool to the author. 80. The information about the Great Ice Shrine was provided in a personal communication by Mark Csikszentmihalyi. 82. For the percentages of happy people in different nations, see George Gallup, 1976. The study that showed U.S. respondents to be about as happy as Cubans and Egyptians was conducted by Easterlin, 1974. For a general discussion of happiness and cross-cultural differences, see Argyll, 1987, pp. 102-11. Affluence and happiness. Both Argyll, 1987, and Veenhoven, 1984, agree, on the basis of their evaluation of practically every study in the field conducted so far, that there is conclusive evidence for a positive but very modest correlation between material well-being and happiness or satisfaction with life. The time budgets for U.S. workers are based on our ESM studies, e.g. Csikszentmihalyi and Grafe 1980, Grafe, Csikszentmihalyi and Giannino 1983, Csikszentmihalyi and Lefebvre 1987-1989. These estimates are very similar to those obtained with much more extensive surveys, e.g. Robinson 1977. 84. Stimulus over-inclusion in schizophrenia. The concept of anhedonia was originally developed by the psychiatrist Roy Grinker. Over-inclusion and the symptomatology of attentional disorders have been studied by, among others, Harrow, Grinker, Holzman, and Caton 1977, and Harrow, Tanover, and Shield 1972. The quotations are from McGee and Chapman, 1961, pp. 109-114. I have argued the continuity between lack of flow experiences due to severe psychopathologies and milder attentional disorders often caused by social deprivation in Csikszentmihalyi, 1978-1982a. 85. Among the studies of the Eskimo that are worth reading are those of 86 Carpenter, 1970-1973. The destruction of Caribbean cultures is described by Mintz, 1985. The concept of anomie was originally developed by Emil Durkheim in his work Suicide, 1897-1951. The best introduction to the concept of alienation is in the early manuscripts of Karl Marx, especially his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, see Tucker 1972. The sociologist Richard Mitchell, 1983-1988, has argued that anomie and alienation are the societal counterparts of anxiety and boredom, respectively, and that they occur when people cannot find flow because the conditions of everyday life are either too chaotic or too predictable. 86. The neurophysiological hypothesis concerning attention and flow is based on the following research: Hamilton, 1976-1981, Hamilton, Holcomb, and Della Pina, 1977, and Hamilton, Heyer, and Buchsbaum, 1984. This line of research is now continuing with the use of more sophisticated brain scanning equipment. 87. Cortical activation is the amount of electrical activity in the cerebral cortex at a given moment in time. Its amplitude, in microvolts, has been used to indicate the general effort taking place in the brain at that time. When people concentrate their attention, their cortical activation is generally found to increase, indicating an increase in mental effort. 89. The study of autotelic families is reported in Rothandy, 1988. His findings are in line with many previous investigations, for instance that securely attached infants engage more in exploratory behavior, Ainsworth, Bell, and Staten 1971, Matas, Arend, and Sroof 1978, or that an optimal balance between love and discipline is the best child-rearing context, Bronfenbrenner 1970, Devereux 1970, Baumrin 1977. The systems approach to family studies, which is very congenial with the one developed here, was pioneered in clinical settings by Bowen, 1978. 90. The people of flow. This is the term Richard Logan, 1985-1988, used to describe individuals who are able to transform trying ordeals into flow experiences. The quote, "If the reach of experience," is from Burney, 1952, pp. 16-18. 91. Eva Zeisel's imprisonment is described in a New Yorker profile, Lessard, 1987. How a Chinese lady survived the brutalities of the Cultural Revolution is the subject of Life and Death in Shanghai, Cheng 1987. Solzhenitsyn's accounts of prison are from the Gulag Archipelago, 1976. The account by Tolas Tibor is reconstructed from personal conversations we had in the summer of 1957, when he was released from jail after the Hungarian Revolution. 92. The quote from Solzhenitsyn is cited in Logan, 1985. Bettelheim presents his generalizations about imprisonment based on his concentration camp experiences in the article Individual and Mass Behavior in Extreme Situations, 1943. For Frankl, see Man's Search for Meaning and the Unheard Cry for Meaning, 1963-1978. 93. The quotation from Russell was cited in an article in Self magazine, Mercer 1987, p. 147.